Turning now to the U.S. and Russian-led agreement to a deal to end the fighting in Syria and give warring parties until Friday to sign up. Will the cessation of hostilities hold long enough for meaningful peace talks to take place? Let's talk about that with Christian Whiton, former U.S. State Department senior advisor and deputy special envoy during the George W. Bush administration. He's also the author of Smart Power: Between Diplomacy and War. All right, is this going to work?
It doesn't look like it. There's just a lot that's stacked against it when you look at the odds. The biggest problem is that the agreement doesn't include ISIS, which is a big driver of the Syrian civil war, and doesn't include the Nusra Front, which is the al-Qaeda affiliate. So, looking for a historical analogy where there's been something like this and it has worked, it's really hard. It's sort of as if you were, going back to the Vietnam era and you made a peace deal with the North Vietnamese army, but it excluded the Viet Cong. Their major forces here, not at work. And then, of course, there's just the duplicity of the Russians. So you're allowed to still use force. The Syrians, Assad, are both allowed to use force after this agreement, but it's supposed to be proportional to the force they're hit with. But the Russian idea of proportional is going to be a lot different than ours is.
If you were advising President Obama, what would you tell him?
You have to, I think, either just focus purely on ISIS to destroy them and leave the rest of the Syrian civil war to, frankly, its own devices. That sounds bad, I know. It's a humanitarian catastrophe. There are more than 250,000 people killed. But if you look at the record of humanitarian intervention, there's a reason we didn't go into Cambodia right after the Vietnam War, and there's a reason we didn't go into Rwanda in the 1990s despite genocide there, and that is our military cannot be a 911 service for the rest of the world. So focusing on where the U.S. interests are, which are more on destroying ISIS than managing an outcome.
Would you send troops in?
If it's necessary, and I think it probably is, to defeat ISIS, you can't just sort of sit in an air-conditioned hotel room in Abu Dhabi or in Istanbul and say, hey, why don't you people go and do the ground fighting? We'll drop some bombs from our drones, but you need to do the work. I think there has to be some U.S. commitment if you want a real Arab force. They're the fundaments of an Arab force. The Saudis and the Emiratis, the Jordanians, even a little bit from Morocco and Egypt, willing to put some muscle on the ground. So it's not just going to be us and sort of a veneer of a coalition. It could be a real coalition. So it doesn't have to be a big occupation, something light footprint. But more important, I think, than whether you put in troops is answering the question, what comes next? I mean, that was the big problem with Iraq, was not a regard for the political outcome, who you want to win. So I think the question of who you want to replace ISIS has to be a confederation of Sunnis. These are not necessarily Boy Scouts, but at least they're not anti-U.S.
Do you think Americans, though, are tired of sending their sons and daughters to die for something so far away?
Yes, I think that's a very justified cause. You look back at Afghanistan, and the Taliban is still in control of parts of that country and seems to be mildly ascendant. Certainly, the Afghans can't stand on their own. Iraq now is basically three countries, and it's hard to point to a clear victory in recent years. I mean, through presidents of two parties now, basically our strategy in dealing with Islamism, or at least dealing with the jihadist end product of that, has failed. So I think you go, and it's a hard sell to the American public, but by saying that we're not going to jump in and try and manage a civil war, that we're going to focus on a more simple and discrete objective, that is why it's worth putting U.S. lives on the line. And also because they're coming at us. I mean, they hit us right here in San Bernardino.
Christian, the president, in his remarks about closing Guantanamo, says keeping the facility open is contrary to our values. You agree?
No, I don't. The use of military tribunals for people who are in violation of the law of war is something we've done throughout our history. These would-be defendants have been given already far more rights than we would have afforded people in the past. There were a number of people in World War II who were dressed in U.S., a number of German operatives who were dressed in U.S. uniforms, and they were promptly shot. Some of the prisoners at Guantanamo, these aren't people who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. One is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the self-admitted mastermind of 9/11. He has not been read his Miranda rights, or at least wasn't when he made, I think, a lot of his statements. A lot of the information about him is gathered for intelligence. That suits itself towards a military tribunal. Again, something that presidents of both parties have failed to bring about. The guy who basically masterminded 9/11 is just sitting in Gitmo.
So can't you bring him to some strong prison outlet and put them on trial as we do in America. Well, they're just sitting there, right?
Right. I think the argument is, and it's a good one, is that the rules of evidence in a civilian court would just be too high, that you would have a lot of very solid evidence that's accurate, that's factual, that nonetheless would have to be excluded. The other side also, and your previous guest, Senator Mitchell, said that Republicans want to close Guantanamo just because it's being proposed, or don't want to close it because it's being proposed by President Obama. I don't think that's really true. And if you look back, it's actually a Democratic Congress, the first Congress of the Obama administration, when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House, that stopped the president from doing this. For a couple of reasons. It's terrible domestic politics. The American people don't want it. But second of all, the claim that this is what's driving jihadism and terrorist recruitment, it's just not so, especially if you look at what captured ISIS prisoners or people who have become disgruntled and left ISIS say. The reason that they were drawn to this has little to do with U.S. foreign policy.
Your work as a diplomat included North Korea. What do you make of that?
Well, you know, it gets in the news about twice a year. It's a threat that's grown steadily worse, and you know, people laugh when they had their first nuclear test in 2006. It was considered a fizzle, a very inefficient nuclear shot. But now they're up to about the 10 kiloton range. They've have a series of successes. That's just a little bit shy of the 15 or so kilotons in Hiroshima. People used to laugh at their rocket program. Rockets would blow up a few seconds off the launch pad. But you learn information from each of these failures. I mean, if you think about the right stuff, the book or the movie, and all the failures of our programs, and then you have a success. And so pretty soon you're going to get a North Korea that can put a miniaturized nuclear weapon on an ICBM and hit the West Coast. And the U.S. combatant commander in Korea has basically said they've gotten close to that. The U.S. response, again, presidents of both parties have gotten this pretty wrong, pretty bad. And there are reports recently that the Obama administration tried to restart talks, but it just seems impossible that we are going to out-negotiate the master negotiators, who are the North Koreans.
You titled your book Smart Power. Give me an effective exercise of it.
A smart power with, well, look at North Korea. I would say rather than trying to rely solely on military defense or just on the softest of diplomatic approaches, which are just talks and garden parties, smart power is everything between those two extremes of just talk and actually killing people. So political warfare, like the type we did during the Cold War, we didn't just have a big military and prepare to fight the Russians in the Fulda Gap if necessary. We also had things like Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America, things that were meant to pierce Soviet censorship, to give them an image of the outside world, a realization that there were alternatives to Marxism, Leninism that worked a lot better. And if you talk to dissidents, whether they were members of Polish Solidarity or refuseniks in the Soviet Union or others, they said those effects actually had a difference, whether it was a political message or just seeing that people had a better lifestyle in the West. So that type of cultural and political warfare, one thing we tried to do with North Korea when that was in my portfolio was get more defectors on the air to broadcast radio back into North Korea, people who can empathize, people who can actually say things.
Are there many?
There are increasing numbers, actually, and you had a big refugee flow out of North Korea because of famine in the 1990s, and it takes time. North Koreans, I mean, they have the strangest and most, you know, sort of fenced-off view of the world possible. It's hard enough for them to master just sort of living life in South Korea in a capitalist system after they've grown up in North Korea. Harder still to learn English and be able to argue to others outside of Korea. But as years go by, it's a little bit what you saw in the Cold War, where refugees and defectors create a political wave.
You supported Scott Walker when he announced and then he withdrew from the primary situation. He said he would clear the field. He left so that a positive conservative message can get out. Who's delivering it and who are you supporting now?
Yeah, I'm leaning toward Ted Cruz. You know, I think in this year of, if you add Trump and Cruz, the support for Trump and Cruz and Carson and Fiorina on the Republican side, you get an electorate that's just very disgusted even with the Republican establishment. So the idea that we're going to flip to another copy of Romney or McCain, which I think would be Marco Rubio, I think that's just unlikely, and concerned if Marco Rubio's on stage with Hillary that he just doesn't quite have the stature and gravitas to compare. So, you know, I think Cruz has a chance of doing very well on Super Tuesday, March 1st, likely to take Texas, perhaps a couple of other states, and that's a key distinction between anyone else left in the field. He will have actually won states, Iowa, others, and can compete with Trump.
You've called Trump a neo-isolationist. What do you mean?
Well, I think he is a bit like President Obama in that he will do things that will move a problem out of the inbox, but not actually resolve it. Thinking that you can outsource our Middle Eastern policy to Russia, if you will, thinking that our interests might be aligned, I think is foolish. And also just saying that you're going to find the next MacArthur, in reference to Douglas MacArthur, and put him in charge of a very strong military, without policies to explain how you're going to change outcomes from the behavior of the Chinese, the behavior of the Russians, the behavior of the Iranians. It just seems to me a way to sound good and sound hawkish without actually coming up with solutions.
How do you explain the Trump phenomena?
I think it's part of what I mentioned earlier. It's just a disgust with the establishment. You talk to Republicans out there, and there's almost as much dislike for leaders like Mitch McConnell and former Speaker John Boehner as there is for President Obama. Also, I think just political correctness, that we're so sick of politicians. And Scott Walker, who I admire greatly, fell into this category of having almost sort of a too perfect answer, polished, poll-tested, focus group tested, seemingly. They weren't actually, but having sort of the cute answer to everything, when in fact what Trump did, just sitting and saying what you actually think, even if it's not something that people agree with, is so refreshing and different, and really has disrupted, to use an overused term, our politics.
And there's something every day from him. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you, Larry.
Always appreciate your input.